Okay, so there's that inheritance pattern. So somebody said, what? Couldn't the father be? So what's the genotype of that male? If this is recessive, this individual does not have a phenotype. So this, right, if this is recessive, that's what the hypothesis is. So if this is a recessive pedigree, then how does it not skip a generation?
Well, couldn't the father be a carrier?
This individual?
No.
The blue arrow?
The father of the female that has it.
This father.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's figure out what all the genotypes could be if this is recessive. So we're going to assume this is recessive. Every affected person has what genotype? So we're going to say A gives a disease. Except it's recessive, so you'd have to be little a over little a to get the disease. So if this is recessive, and this is exactly how you should do every single pedigree analysis. Pick one inheritance pattern, work through the whole pedigree, see if it makes sense with that inheritance pattern. If it doesn't, if you find any evidence that says this is not consistent with how inheritance would work, then you know it's not that inheritance pattern. So now we're starting with recessive. Okay, so every individual that's affected, if this is recessive, has the same genotype. Has to have both copies of the gene be the recessive version. That's a little a. Okay, so now what has to be true for this inheritance pattern to occur? So the father of the affected female, what's his genotype then? Has to be, if he was little a, he'd have a filled in symbol, so we know it's not little a over little a. Could it be big A over big A? No, because then he wouldn't be able to have a little a over little a offspring. So has to be AA. Yes, right, of course. Big A, little a. That father would have to be a carrier. Right, so far we haven't broken any rules. We haven't guessed any information that wasn't already on the pedigree because we don't see carriers. Remember, this is phenotypes. So somebody in this pedigree went to the doctor and said, I have this disease. And the doctor looks back through the generations and said, okay, who else in your family had the disease? So you never know who the carriers are. You have to figure out who the carriers are. So we're looking for possible carriers. We're never going to know unless we go exhume somebody, dig them up, and get DNA from their bones and genotype them. We'll never know if any individual, if they're dead, was a carrier or not. We have to infer that information. So what else do we have to know for this to make sense being a recessive disorder? How did we get the trait down here in this generation? If there are some little a's over little a's, everybody got one little a from the mom, so what's dad's genotype? This heterozygous. He's also got to be a carrier. Please, have lots of questions. This is...
For the first generation of the inheritance pattern.
This up here?
Is the one with the square, little a, little a.
Why?
Yes, why?
Because this individual has the disease, and so if we assume this is recessive, they have to be homozygous for the mutant allele.
So the square is the disease.
Square is the father. Filled in symbol means he's got the disease. So every square is a male. Every circle's a female. And open symbol, filled in symbol. So if it's filled in, they've got the disease. And open symbol means no disease. So we've got information, all we've got information about is phenotypes, the traits. We don't have any information about genotypes. We're inferring all of that. We're taking phenotype information and converting that into what we think the genotypes would be, again, if this is a recessive disorder.
Couldn't we also infer that it's an autosomal disease because you have a male and a female up in the first generation of
Well, we're not going to go into that yet because we haven't even talked about the non-autosomal, but yes. So these are all going to be autosomal cases until next class when we watch the rest of the movie, which had to do with X-linked and Y-linked traits. But you're absolutely right. The main key to look for there is, are both males and females equally affected? Very good. Yeah? Ah. So yeah, what else can we figure out about all of these? If this is recessive, do we know anything about this female's genotype? So I heard homozygous dominant. What's the other option? Could be a carrier. Can we distinguish between those two? What do you expect if the mom's a carrier? Yes. How many of her kids would have the disease? Every individual is going to get a little a from dad. Absolutely. If this is recessive. So if the mom's a carrier, half of her kids get her big A, half of her kids get her little a, so half of her kids should be. Aha. Should be. We expect to be if she's heterozygous, but that's probability. So then we'd have to do what? Chi-square test. Which is exactly what we're going to do. Not right now with this example, but yes, this is another way that we use the chi-square test. We've only seen 4 kids. We don't know, bottom line, we don't know if the mom's a carrier or homozygous for the capital A allele because we haven't yet looked at enough offspring to know for sure. If she had a little a, would we have seen it pass on to one of her kids yet? 4 kids is not enough. So we don't know anything about her genotype. That's still a big question mark. But regardless, the point that was made earlier is still valid. What do we know about the genotype of every individual here in generation 2? If they're not filled in, if they don't have the disease, everybody is a carrier. Why? It means they're heterozygous. So why is every one of those siblings heterozygous?
They all have at least one little a from the mom.
Both of the parents, at least one of the parents of both of those sets of siblings is homozygous. Little a over little a. So it has to be that in both sides of this pedigree, those affected parents pass at least one copy of the trait, recessive disorder, to all of their kids. So everybody in the second generation is at least a carrier, except for this individual. So because we see that individual being affected, we know that the father, as we already did, we know that the father has to be a carrier. And again, because this second generation mom that's affected has to be homozygous for little a, all of her kids are either going to be carriers or affected, depending on which allele they inherited from the father. Capital A or little a. So is anything about this inconsistent with being recessive? Is there any way that you can totally say, rule out beyond a reasonable doubt, like for a courtroom, that this is recessive? Is there anything we couldn't explain away? Perfectly consistent with being recessive, assuming that our assumptions about who are carriers is correct. So it could be recessive. Could it be dominant? Let me load that up again, a fresh copy this time. So could this be a dominant inheritance pattern? What's wrong with this being dominant?
more affected individuals in that family.
So 3 generations. It's present in every generation. That's what we expect of a dominant inheritance pattern. Who wants to argue with me? Yeah, please.
Argue
Great.
against or for?
I'm just asking for input. So
could be dominant.
let me say, let's do it this way. This is a dominant pedigree. Now, you tell me why it might not be. You say, Dr. Ross, you're wrong. Yeah.
Well, can someone argue that the second generation on the right-hand side, no one has it, so it's just surprising that it's dominant? I mean, statistically, I guess they have more kids that have it, but if it's dominant,
That's, yeah, exactly right. So a dominant disease, you'd expect how many of these kids to have the trait. This is dominant now. So if you get one bad copy of the gene, you get the disease.
But that's if they're homozygous.
Ah. So what's this male's genotype?
Heterozygous, if she's recessive, they could all very well be recessive.
Could either be, oops. So dominant traits. Now the capital A causes the disease.
Well, that would be yeah,
So which genotype is the dad?
the square. Big A little.
Be heterozygous.
Has to be heterozygous. What would happen if the dad was big A over big A? Exactly right.
Capital A causes the disease?
That's correct. So we're assuming, I'm telling you this is dominant. And I'm trying to ask you to argue with me about whether or not it really is.
So, once homozygous dominant, once heterozygous dominant, wouldn't they both have the disease?
So the dad could be either of those genotypes.
Okay.
And I'm asking which one is it?
I thought you were assigning it to the.
Yeah, oh, sorry, no. Either of those are for the dad. Sorry about that. So yes, you're absolutely right. If the dad was homozygous for the capital A, how would this pedigree change? All of his kids would inherit at least one capital A allele from him. They'd all be affected. Okay, so we can rule out, if this is dominant, we know that the dad isn't that genotype, so he must be heterozygous. Is that a carrier? No, not for a dominant trait, because he shows the disease phenotype. Okay. So that's dad's genotype, if I'm right, and if this is dominant. So what's wrong with generation 2?
That's not going to have the disease.
Okay,
But it depends, because if the mom is homozygous recessive, then it's just probability that the 4 offspring they had, none of them.
it's
have-
not recessive, I'm saying it's dominant.
Yeah, I know, like,
Okay.
if the mother is,
So what's her
homozygous
genotype?
recessive, so if the mother is little a,
Yep, gotcha.
if you cross it, you have one probability that all of them are little a, but that's, not what we could expect, because we have a little a from that,
Right.
but that's a really small probability.
So, yeah, exactly. What are the, if you cross dad, he's a heterozygote, with mom is a homozygote, then how many of their kids should have a capital A?
At least 50%.
At least 50%. Half should get dad's big A. And half, Mendel's rules, etc. Half should get little a. So in that case, these kids, if this is dominant, should show a phenotype. But you're absolutely right. What if we just haven't observed dad fertilizing a kid with a big A carrying sperm yet? We've only seen 4 kids. What if we looked at one more kid and they have the phenotype? Then it would still be totally consistent with this being a dominant inheritance pattern. So just because, but punchline, just because on this side of the family it seems to skip a generation doesn't mean this is not dominant. It just means maybe that we haven't seen that dominant trait in that generation yet.
Isn't it the same kind of probability we saw when we tried it as recessive?
Exactly the same approach for doing a chi-square analysis. So now it's time to do that. So for the next 10 minutes or so, do a chi-square analysis with these data. So before you start though, like everybody use Google Sheets, Excel, calculator by hand if you want. You've got computers, you might as well use a computer. What are our observed and our expected values before I set you forth doing the calculations? What are our categories? Diseased and not. So if this is dominant, how many diseased kids do we expect of those 4 siblings? 2. We expected 2 diseased and 2 not. That was these values. Their genotypes then morphed into their phenotypes. Anybody with a capital A should be affected. Anyone with a lowercase a should not. And we've observed 0 diseased for wild type. So simple chi-square test. So take a little bit of time, do the chi-square test, and see what your p-value is. We'll go from there in about 3 to 5 minutes. Feel free to raise your hand if you want me to come ask a technical or answer a technical question or a non-technical question. I'm trying to figure out if this is dominant or recessive. Feel free to talk. It doesn't have to be quiet. Maybe you don't want to talk. Consult with the neighbor when you're done and make sure your calculation agrees. What'd you get?
Mendel's wrong.
Mendel's wrong? Duh. What's the chi-square value?
2. 4.
Chi-square value is 4, so you have to remember to do observed minus expected squared over expected for each of the 2 different categories and add them together right there. So chi-square value is 4. Here's the chi-square table. What's the p-value? So 1 degree of freedom, because we had 2 categories, phenotype affected or not. So 2 minus 1 is 1 degree of freedom. So then we just look until we find chi-square value of 4, which is right there between 3.8 and 6.6. So there's the p-value. It's smaller than 0.05. Hence, the interpretation that p-value is significant. So p less than 0.05 means what to our guess? We're wrong. We reject the null hypothesis, which means in our language, our guess, our estimation, our assumption was wrong. Our expectation was wrong. So the expectation is the null hypothesis. It means we've got a less than 5% chance that we are right. What was the expectation again in terms of the pedigree? we were asking something about somebody's genotype. What was the expectation? We were asking if he was heterozygous. That was our assumption. We based this whole analysis on that point, that male was heterozygous. This says, if he was heterozygous, and you've seen 4 kids and none of them have the phenotype, we would have seen that big A allele by now. There's less than 5% chance that we haven't seen it. It means, in other words, put it yet another way, if we looked at one more kid, if we looked at his 5th offspring, there's a less than 5% chance that his 5th offspring would have the disease. So 4 is sort of the magic number, between 3 and 4 in terms of chi-square analysis. If you look at 3 observations, you never have enough data to make any sort of claim about statistics when you have 2 choices. So if you flip a coin and you come up with heads 3 times, that's chance. Do it 4 times in a row, now you're onto something. Go to Vegas. Caveat, that's only true for 1 degree of freedom, when you've got 2 choices. Disease or not, heads or tails, when you add degrees of freedom, then it's not 4 anymore, it's many more observations you have to make before you decision. Now I threw a few of your pedigrees in here, so I'm going to take this question, but while we're addressing this question, same analysis. Is this a dominant or recessive inheritance pattern that one of you submitted? And your question?
I was gonna ask, like, if on the test you give us that and we say, well, it's very likely dominant, heterozygous or this and that, and we can show you exactly how that would work out, even though it doesn't fit the chi-square, would we be wrong?
No. In other words, that's that big slide at the start with the triangle and the yellow and the exclamation point. There's never necessarily one absolutely correct answer. There will be times when I will show you a pedigree that you will absolutely know is not one type of inheritance pattern. There will be something that breaks the rule. And you'll say, okay, I'm sure it's not that pattern. But if you have something like what we just did, where it's totally ambiguous, you should be able to do the chi-square test and say, I'm pretty sure it's this. So the way I'll ask these questions, in other words, is I'll say, which is the most likely? And if I say most likely, or if I write most likely on an exam, that means do the chi-square test. Or argue with me, reason with me. Tell me why you think that one inheritance pattern is more likely than another. So as long as you do a good job of reasoning, either answer could be correct.
We were saying that the data was heterozygous, but doing the chi-square value, it showed us that that's not going to work. Then, because there's less chance that the next kid is going to have the disease. Would that mean that it's not going to be a dominant disease then?
So the chi-square value in that case, p less than 0.05, tells us that the assumption that he's a heterozygote is wrong. So he's homozygous for the wild type allele, which explains why he has no affected kids. So for that pedigree, it's still reasonable to say that it's dominant. Okay, take this pedigree. Dominant or recessive? Say this is an exam question. What's your first thought? What's the #1 rule for dominance? It's in every generation. Except for the last one, but the parent's not affected. So that's okay. Right? If this individual doesn't have the disorder, then of course they wouldn't necessarily pass it to any of their kids. Could it be recessive? I totally agree this could be dominant. Absolutely. Fits all the criteria. What about recessive? So what has to be, if this is a recessive, any recessive phenotype, if one parent is affected and the other one is not, look up here, and they have affected kids, then what do you know about the unaffected parent? Has to be a carrier. Okay, look down here. Here's one affected parent, one not. They have some affected kids. Could it be recessive? Yes, if the mom's a carrier.
Would you make both those parents to other parents? What is that your saying?
Which means that, yeah, so what would we be able to guess about the genotypes of those parents? Somebody has to have that one mutant allele. Who is it? How many copies? Now we don't have any information. Because they could be, one could be a carrier, the other one could be a carrier, they could both be carriers. We don't know. But nothing says that this is not a recessive disorder. This could be either. Trick question, really easy. Dominant or recessive? So I know the symbols aren't totally filled in. This is a case where you can show 4 different phenotypes at once. So if there's any color in the upper left-hand corner of any of these symbols, that means they're affected. Has disease in the key in the upper left there. So it's in the first generation, it's in the second generation, it's not in the third generation. Really easy question to answer.
Recessive.
Why is this recessive? Because there's carriers. The end.
Yeah.
That's it. If there's carriers, it's got to be recessive. Next. Dominant or recessive? Recessive. Good. You're right. There's carriers. So if there's a carrier, that defines it as being a recessive trait. End of story. Easy. Questions to this point? You can stare at the screen, you can nod. It's a good time to summarize, answer lingering questions, doubts, concerns, uncertainties. You do some statistics, try to rule out the uncertainties. So simple principles so far. Things you watched in the movie, if it's dominant, it's usually in every generation. If it's recessive, it's skips a generation. If there's a carrier, I'm telling you it's a recessive trait. And in general, most pedigrees you will ever see are going to be ambiguous. So this is from the movie. I told you in the movie, I think I was going to show you this pedigree again. So I've got 2 questions that I'd like you to work together again for 2 or 3 minutes. What are the genotypes of the parents? And how many F2, so this is recessive, yeah. What are the genotypes of all 4 of the P0 generation? And how many individuals in the F2 generation are carriers? So go ahead and work together or individually on that. And in about 3 minutes, we're going to pull back together and answer those last few questions. Go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. You're troubleshooting. Yep, you're right on. is good.
Yeah, I need to find what I
Yeah, right now.
I was just not a genius that only kept with that original.
I can identify with that. Okay. As you're solving this problem, where did you start? It was a great opportunity to figure out how to do pedigree analysis because it's not intuitive at all. I don't expect anybody to say, oh, I know exactly how to do this. So where do you start?
I start by looking at the F1 parents of the F2.
Okay. So, folks, your attention please. So the question was, how do you start doing this analysis? How do you figure out the genotypes of an older generation? So you start from the bottom and you work your way up. So this is recessive. What are the genotypes of the F1 parents? Which is, for a recessive trait, carrier. Hence, those two parents don't show the phenotype, but those two lowercase alleles, we're still using A, I guess. You can still get some little a over little a affected kids. Bless you. Now, that should get us to the genotypes of the P0s, the first question. So if this is recessive, we know that the filled in symbols are homozygous lowercase. So what do you think the genotypes of the unaffected parents are? Okay, I heard a few homozygous dominant, so I'll write that in. Then let's discuss. What's the other option? They could be heterozygous, they could be carriers. So this is where, even if you don't want to do the statistical analysis, you could argue they're more likely what than what? They're more likely homozygous than heterozygous, because if they were heterozygous, you would be more likely to have seen affected kids. We have no disease in the F1 generation at all. So it's more likely that the two unaffected parents are homozygous for big A. Now, does it prove it? They could both be carriers. And you could still see this pattern in the pedigree. Could. There's a chance. Maybe a really small chance, but there's still a chance. Okay. So if this is true, if the F1 parents are both carriers, this is where I sort of glossed over this in the movie. I went this far, and I hadn't done this analysis in advance on my little sheet of notes that you can't see down there. And when I got here, I said something like, some number of F2s are going to be carriers. And then I moved on. Because I didn't want to stop and think about it right there. But now it's a good time to stop and think about it. We've got 8 kids in the F2 generation. 2 of them are affected. How many carriers?
4 carriers.
4 carriers. Why? What do we do that you did 2 or 3 weeks ago that tells us the answer to this? Yeah, Punnett square. So you're crossing 2 carriers together. One's a capital A, little a, the other is a carrier also. So for every one diseased individual, the lowercase over lowercase, you get 2 carriers, big A over little a. So if you've got 8 kids, you should have 1 affected, 2 carriers that are unaffected, and then a 3rd unaffected kid.
Would there be 2 more carriers in the F1 generation?
Well, it's 8 kids, so that's a 1 to, you've got, every 4 kids, in other words, right here, for every 4 kids, 2 of them should be carriers. So if you've got 8 kids, then you've got 4 carriers, you've got 2 little a over little a's, and then you've got 2 big A over big A. And of course, that's only if things are working exactly as you'd predict from Mendelian genetics, which, of course, in a real family doesn't have to happen that way. It'd be close to a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio.
I have a question
Please.
For the F1 generation, wouldn't they all be carriers?
Indeed.
So if they were all carriers and each of them had kids, then we would multiply, we would get 32 individuals who are carriers in the F2 generation.
Depending on the number of offspring that each person has.
Yeah, we'd have to look at the genotypes of the offspring from all of the carriers to know what we would expect from their kids. Yeah. So here we're looking at a cross between two carriers. What happens, to answer sort of indirectly, what happens if you have a carrier and an unaffected parent and they have 8 kids? And this is a recessive trait still. How would I fill in the symbols in that second generation? What would Mendel predict? What's our expectation?
That half of them would have it.
Half of them would have what? Yes. So half of them would get the recessive allele. For every kid this father has, half of them get capital A, and they are not carriers, and the other half would get his lowercase a and be carriers. So you don't see any disease this generation, but you still get carriers. So if you were a genetic counselor and you knew somebody had an affected parent that had a genetic disease that was recessive, so you knew they were a carrier, I could ask you a question like, how many kids would you counsel this person to have to prevent having any carriers in the following generation?
Well, it wouldn't matter because there is a chance that they would all carry it, so it wouldn't matter.
Yep, you got a 50-50 chance that any kid of yours, if you're a carrier, is a carrier.
So I guess the biggest would be to have 0 kids. If you
There you go. Yep, and then overpopulation is solved and everybody's happy, except for the people that want to have kids.
Yeah.
Adopt. Yeah. I'm being a little bit facetious. I don't think a genetic counselor would ever tell anybody that, but that's one way to apply this information. If you've got carriers in your family, there's a 50-50 chance that if you have one parent that's a carrier, that you're a carrier of a recessive disease.
But then you can get yourself genotyped and you can see if maybe your spouse.
Well, you could, yes, if the disease has a known genetic cause, then personal genetics could help. You could actually get your DNA and your spouse's DNA or partner's DNA sampled, and you would know if you were both carriers and were likely to have actually affected kids. All right. I'm going to save this, which I asked you to work on last class. Save this for next class or maybe never. We'll see. I just want to walk you through briefly. I know we're close, but please keep paying attention. I just want to explain what the rest of these slides are so you can work on them yourself if you want some more practice. I put this one in for another chi-square practice example. It's exactly like what we already did, exactly. But you can work on this too if you want to practice chi-square analysis. So I put a couple summary slides in here. I'm not going to read over them. You can if you want to. But what I'd like you to do is, for autosomal recessive conditions, normally for autosomal, as was pointed out earlier, and we'll see this for the next video you watch for Wednesday, males and females for autosomal recessive or dominant diseases are equally affected. That is, you will see as many females as males on average have the disease. The disease usually skips a generation, and affected individuals have to be homozygous for the mutant allele. Are there any situations where those guidelines won't apply?
Yeah.
I want you to think about that for next class and tell me, because I was too lazy to come up with a long list of them. So I'd like you to figure it out. You create this information, bring it to class next time. And then, got one movie to watch for next class, come back together and we'll keep moving. See you next time.